I had always trusted her. I mean, I thought I knew her better than anyone else. But when I walked in that day, everything changed. It was late afternoon, and I'd just come back from a grueling day at work. The house smelled like burnt garlic and something off, but I couldn't quite place it. I figured she'd been trying a new recipe. She often got in the mood to experiment in the kitchen, even though she couldn't cook to save her life. It was part of who she was, ambitious but never quite following through. I put my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and called out her name, expecting the usual response. Nothing. I took a few steps toward the kitchen, half expecting to see her there, still trying to salvage whatever culinary disaster was on the stove. But instead, there was a man standing in our living room, a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, broad, dressed casually but with an air about him, confident, too comfortable in my home. My heart skipped a beat. He was sitting on the couch, facing the television, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The real shock came when I saw her, Samantha, walk into the room from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, a smile plastered across her face. It wasn't just the man, it wasn't just her sudden appearance. It was how she looked, how weirdly normal everything felt, as though she hadn't been caught in a moment of absolute betrayal. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice light and casual. She had that fake sweetness in her tone, the kind that made my skin crawl. "I didn't expect you home so soon." The man didn't even turn around. He just sat there, like he belonged, like I was the intruder. Something in my gut twisted. "Who the hell is this?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper, thick with confusion and an immediate flare of anger. Samantha's smile faltered for just a second, only a second, but that was enough for me to see the truth. I didn't need to hear the name, I didn't need any explanation. I already knew. She wasn't even trying to hide it. "Oh, it's just a friend," she said, but I could see her eyes dart toward the man, a silent signal. "We were catching up. You know, you've been working so much lately, I thought I'd have someone over. Don't make this a big deal." I could hear the lies slipping out of her mouth, each one more ridiculous than the last. A friend? What kind of friend comes over uninvited and just makes themselves comfortable? I was furious. I felt a lump in my throat, not because I was sad, but because I was livid. How could she be so blatant? So reckless? I stared at the man for a long moment. There was a strange recognition behind his eyes, like he knew I could see through all the lies, that he knew what was really going on. But I wasn't about to stand there and let this farce continue. I walked over to the couch, stood in front of it, and glared down at both of them. "Don't lie to me, Sam," I growled, my voice steady but full of anger. "You've been sleeping with him, haven't you?" Her face paled for a moment, then she forced out a laugh, trying to dismiss it, to turn the situation into some sick joke. "You're crazy," she said, almost too calmly. "You're imagining things. This is nothing. Just relax." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. My heart pounded against my ribs. She was lying again. And I was done with it. Before I could say anything else, the man finally looked up at me. He didn't seem scared. If anything, he seemed amused, like he had won some twisted game, and I was the one who'd lost. "I think it's time you left, man," he said, his voice low and dismissive. "Time to leave?" The audacity of him. I wanted to throw him out of my house, but something stopped me. Instead, I turned to Samantha, my voice breaking through the anger that was threatening to consume me. "Why? Why him?" I asked, barely able to keep my composure. "What's so special about him?" But instead of answering, Samantha just shrugged, tossing the towel on the counter as if she didn't even care that her whole world was crumbling apart before her eyes. "Because I'm done with you," she said, her voice cold now, venom dripping from every word. "You've been boring, predictable. I needed excitement. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. She was done with me. And that was all. For a moment, the world around me faded. Nothing mattered but the betrayal I was staring at. Samantha had been planning this, cheating, lying, manipulating. And I'd been blind to it all. I wasn't just angry. I was disgusted. I had never been so humiliated in my entire life. But this was just the beginning. The lies were only getting started, and I would make her pay. This was just the first revelation. There was more to come. So much more. I stood there, frozen, trying to digest the words she had just thrown at me like daggers. My mind was racing, thoughts colliding in chaos. Done with me? How could she be so cold? How could she just dismiss everything we'd built? The house we bought together, the vacations, the inside jokes, the quiet mornings over coffee, it was all a lie, wasn't it? I wasn't sure what to say next. I wasn't even sure I could say anything. Part of me wanted to scream, to break something, anything to release the knot tightening in my chest. Another part of me wanted to run, to get out of this house, this life, anything to escape the suffocating reality that my marriage had crumbled in front of me. Samantha, on the other hand, stood there with that smug look on her face, her arms crossed, daring me to challenge her. She looked unbothered, almost like she had already moved on. Like this had been some kind of inevitability. "I'm not going to stand here and argue with you," she finally said, her voice laced with that familiar arrogance I'd come to hate. "You're not going to change my mind. I don't love you anymore. And that's that." "That's that?" I repeated, disbelief cutting through my voice. "You're really going to just say that, after everything? After I've given you everything? You just throw it away like it's nothing?" She rolled her eyes, and I saw red. She wasn't even trying anymore. She was looking at me like I was some inconvenience she was too tired to deal with. "You don't get it, do you? You haven't been enough for a long time. And now I've found someone who actually makes me feel alive." I took a deep breath, fighting back the urge to lash out physically, to hurt her the way she had hurt me. But that wasn't me. And I wasn't about to stoop to her level, even though every fiber of my being wanted to. I turned away. The sight of them together in that room, the room that had once felt like our sanctuary, was too much. I grabbed my coat from the hallway, my hands shaking as I struggled to put it on. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from them as possible. I had to get out. I needed space. I couldn't breathe in here, surrounded by the lies, the coldness. I didn't look back. Not at her, not at him. I didn't even care anymore. The only thing that mattered was getting out of that house. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, my eyes blurry with anger and confusion, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The thought that kept repeating in my head was the same: how could she do this to me? But no matter how many times I asked myself that question, I couldn't find an answer that made sense. There was no justification for what she had done. There was no rational explanation. She had cheated on me, and worse, she had let me be a fool for far too long. Eventually, I pulled over to the side of the road. I wasn't sure where I was, but that didn't matter. I turned off the engine, leaned back in the seat, and let my mind wander. Hours passed. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the empty road ahead of me. I could still hear her voice in my head, the way she said she was done with me, as if I had meant nothing at all. I thought of the man sitting in my living room, the one who'd been sharing my wife's bed. I thought of how easy it had been for them, how easily she had moved on. I could have gone home then, to confront her, to make her explain herself. But what was the point? I'd heard enough. I didn't need her excuses. I didn't need her lies. What I needed was to understand why I had let this happen. How had I missed the signs? Had I been so absorbed in my own world that I didn't notice her slipping away? I didn't have the answers yet. But I would. I would find a way to get them, to get back to some sense of control. I wasn't about to let her have the last word in this twisted drama. I drove back home, but this time, I wasn't angry in the same way. It wasn't rage that fueled me anymore, it was something else. It was cold, calculating determination. I wasn't going to let her break me. I walked back into that house like a stranger. The place that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a prison. I could hear Samantha talking to the man in the next room, their voices low and hushed, like they didn't even care that I had just walked in. But what I did next was nothing like what I had done before. I wasn't going to ask her for anything. No more begging. No more pleading. I grabbed my phone, dialed a number, and set the wheels in motion. I wasn't going to waste any more time. The next few days were a blur. It all moved so fast. I called a lawyer. I made arrangements. I could hear Samantha's voice echoing in my head, but this time, it wasn't filled with sadness or anger. It was numb. When I finally confronted her again, I was a different person. This time, I didn't ask her why. I didn't need to. I told her what was going to happen next. That was all. Her face turned pale when I handed her the divorce papers. She tried to argue, to plead, but I had no interest in her words. I had nothing left to say to her. And as I walked out the door, leaving her there to deal with the mess she had created, I realized that she had never mattered as much as I had thought she did. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about reclaiming my life. I didn't think it would be that easy. But it was. The moment I signed those papers, everything shifted. There was no more weight on my chest, no more uncertainty in my heart. The decision had been made, and it was like stepping out of a nightmare into a harsh, unforgiving reality. It wasn't the end I wanted, but it was the one I needed. The one I'd been avoiding for far too long. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the world around me had softened. Every sound felt muted. I stayed in the house for a few more days, sorting through the remnants of my life, but there was no joy left in it. Each room felt like an echo of what had been, a hollow memory of a time before the lies and betrayal. Samantha was gone. She had taken her things, or at least, most of them. There was nothing left of her but the cold, empty spaces she had once filled with her presence. But that wasn't what struck me the hardest. It wasn't the silence. It wasn't the emptiness. It was what she had left behind, the lingering smell of her perfume, the abandoned coffee cup she'd never finished on the kitchen counter, the little things that made it feel like she was still there, like everything had been some terrible dream I could wake up from. I couldn't stay there, not anymore. So I packed a bag, just the essentials. It wasn't a dramatic exit, not the kind you'd see in a movie. I didn't slam the door behind me, I didn't shout or demand answers. I simply left. I didn't know where I was going. Somewhere far, somewhere I could breathe without the weight of her betrayal hanging over me. I drove, aimlessly again, letting the road stretch out before me, a never-ending path that felt oddly comforting. I had no destination, no plan. Just the need to escape, to run, to find something I hadn't even realized I was looking for. Hours passed. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and I found myself on a quiet back road somewhere between the city and nowhere. I pulled off to the side of the road, parked, and sat in the car, staring out into the distance. It wasn't until then that I let the emotions hit me. The rage, the sadness, the frustration, all of it washed over me in a wave I hadn't prepared for. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard I thought my knuckles might snap, and my chest tightened like a fist. It wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was everything. All the years I had given her, all the love and trust one had poured into something that had never been real. She had been a stranger to me for longer than I realized. Tears burned in my eyes, and for a moment, I didn't care. I let them fall. I let them burn my face, let them carry away some of the weight I'd been carrying for so long. I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't weak. I was just human. And in that moment, I realized something else too. Something I hadn't thought about when I was too angry to see straight. I had been surviving in a relationship, in a lie, for so long that I'd forgotten what it meant to live. I didn't need Samantha. I didn't need her lies, her manipulation, her betrayal. She had been a toxic presence in my life, and I had been too blind to see it. But now I was free. The chains were broken, and I could breathe again. The next few weeks were a blur. I made phone calls to friends and family, trying to piece together the fragments of my life that Samantha had torn apart. I sold the house. I didn't need it anymore. It was just another reminder of everything I had lost. But what I gained in the process was a newfound sense of clarity. I began to rebuild. Not the life I had with her, but a life that was mine, untouched, untainted by her actions. And then, out of nowhere, she called. I didn't pick up the first few times, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound unaffected, trying to mask the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. "Please, can we talk?" Her voice was different this time, soft, pleading, almost desperate. It was a tone I hadn't heard from her in years, not since the early days of our relationship. But I wasn't fooled. I knew better now. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Sam," I replied. The words were cold, final, but I wasn't sorry. "Not anymore." She sighed, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake. I know I hurt you. I don't know what I was thinking. Can you just give me a chance to explain?" I almost laughed. Explain? What was there to explain? She had already explained herself in every lie, every glance toward that man, every piece of betrayal she had handed me. But I didn't say that. I didn't have to. I was done. "You've said enough," I said, and with that, I hung up the phone. There was no need for words. I didn't need her explanations, her guilt-ridden apologies. I had moved on. And that was something she would never understand. But what came next was the unexpected part. The part that made everything come full circle. It was a few days later when I got the call. The one I wasn't prepared for. Samantha had been in an accident. A car crash, to be precise. I wasn't sure what exactly happened, but the report was clear: she had been in the passenger seat with that man, the one she had been seeing behind my back. The irony of it hit me hard. She had sought excitement, and it had led her down a path she would never return from. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel anything. It was the strangest thing. It wasn't sadness either, not really. It was just quiet. I drove to the hospital, not because I cared, but because something in me needed to see it, needed to see the consequences of her choices. But when I got there, I saw him first. The man. He was pacing outside, his face pale, his eyes darting around nervously. The guilt was written all over him, but he didn't see me approach. I tapped him on the shoulder, my breath steady, my hand firm. He turned around, his face going ashen. He didn't say a word. "You got what you wanted," I said quietly. "I hope it was worth it." And with that, I walked away. The woman I had once loved was gone, in more ways than one. And I didn't need to feel anything for her anymore. What she had done to me, to us, it was her burden to carry now. Not mine. I was free. And that was enough. I didn't think I'd ever feel that kind of cold detachment. You know the kind, the one where it doesn't matter anymore, where the wounds have scabbed over, and the pain has lost its power. But it was there, the moment I walked away from that hospital. I should have felt something, relief, anger, regret, anything, but it was nothing. Just an empty space where emotions used to be. It was almost peaceful, in a strange way. The days after were a blur of quiet moments, of time slowing down in a way that I hadn't known in years. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. It wasn't out of some need for privacy, it was just that I didn't care. My life had become mine again, a blank canvas where the colors weren't yet chosen, but I had the brush in my hand. A week passed, and I found myself sitting at a small bar in a place I'd never been before. I needed to be far away from everything that reminded me of the old life, the life with her. The bartender, an older man with a gruff voice, poured me another drink without asking, as though he could see it on my face. The pain, the uncertainty, the brokenness. "Rough time?" he asked, as if he had the right to know. But in a way, it didn't matter. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I wasn't even looking for answers. I just needed to be somewhere where no one knew who I was, where no one cared about what had happened. "Something like that," I said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. It burned in a way that reminded me that I was still alive, still capable of feeling something. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was okay with that. But then, without warning, the door swung open. It was the last thing I expected, but I recognized her voice before I even saw her. Samantha. She was laughing, that familiar, fake laugh that used to make my stomach churn. It cut through the hum of the bar like a knife, and I could feel my pulse quicken. She walked in with a new man, some stranger I didn't recognize, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the way she walked, confident, too confident. Like she was in control of everything. Like she had it all figured out. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to keep my back turned, to leave before she saw me. But I couldn't. I wasn't going to run from her anymore. Not after everything. And then, in the most unexpected twist of all, she saw me. Her eyes widened for a split second, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. But then it was gone, replaced by that same smug smile I had come to know all too well. She leaned in, whispered something in the new guy's ear, and then, just like that, she started heading straight toward me. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just sat there, waiting for her to come. Well, she said, standing a few feet away from my seat, crossing her arms. She looked different, more put together than she used to. Like she had found a way to rebuild herself, or at least pretend to. "I never thought I'd find you here." I didn't speak right away. I couldn't. I wasn't sure what I was feeling in that moment. Anger? No. Disgust? Maybe, but it wasn't overwhelming. I just looked at her. Looked at the woman who had betrayed me, who had twisted everything we'd built into some dark, manipulative game. "Funny," I said, my voice steady, even though I could feel the storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. "I never thought I'd see you here either. With him." Her smile didn't waver. It was almost sickening how composed she was. "Oh, please. Don't act like you care. You got what you wanted, didn't you? A clean break. No strings. No mess." I leaned back in my chair, taking another sip of my drink, letting the silence stretch between us. "I didn't want this. Not like this." She laughed then, louder than I expected. "Of course you didn't. You never wanted it, but you never really saw me either. Not the way I needed you to." It hit me then. She had never cared about me. Not in the way I thought she did. All those years, all the moments I thought we shared, they had meant nothing to her. And now here she was, standing in front of me with the same fake smile, the same coldness. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I wasn't hurt. I just didn't care. She was nothing to me now. She was a ghost, a remnant of a past life I had shed like a skin that no longer fit. Is that what you really think? I asked, meeting her eyes. That I didn't see you? That I didn't care? Her face faltered, just for a moment, just long enough for me to see the cracks in the facade. You never gave me what I needed, she said, the words coming out as sharp as knives. I wanted someone who could keep up, someone who didn't bore me. She emphasized the last word like it was some great insult, and for a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But that's the thing, Sam, I said, leaning forward slightly. I did give you everything. I gave you my trust, my love. I gave you my loyalty. But you never cared about that, did you? You were always just looking for more, always just taking. And in the end, it wasn't even about us anymore. It was just about you. About your need for excitement. She didn't say anything. The smugness had vanished, and now there was only silence between us. Good luck with him, I added, gesturing toward the man she had walked in with, the new guy who was still standing in the background, awkwardly watching. I hope it was worth it. And with that, I stood up. I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't need to. I walked out of that bar, out of that life, and into something new. Something where I didn't have to answer to anyone. It was over. Finally. I didn't look back when I left that bar. I didn't need to see the confusion on her face, or the disappointment in the man's eyes. I wasn't interested in any more drama, any more games. It was over, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe. The air felt sharper, clearer, as if something heavy had been lifted from my chest. I walked down the street without a plan, without any real destination in mind. I was done with plans. Life had a way of throwing curveballs at me that I wasn't ready for, and yet, here I was, still standing, still moving forward. I didn't know how long I walked, but the night grew darker, and I found myself at a small park. It was quiet, except for the distant sounds of the city. A few people were sitting on benches, lost in their own worlds, but the place felt peaceful. I sat on a bench, not bothering to check the time, just letting myself exist for a moment without the weight of everything that had just happened. The thought of her, of Samantha, drifted into my mind again, but I pushed it away. I wasn't going to let her take up any more of my mental space. She had already taken enough. The pain she'd caused, the lies she'd spun, had taken their toll on me. But I wasn't going to let that be my defining moment. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. There were a few people I could call, friends I hadn't spoken to in a while, but I wasn't ready for that yet. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't need anyone's pity. Not when I was already taking the first steps toward my own redemption. The more I sat there, the more it became clear to me, I needed to let go. Of her, of everything that had been holding me back. I had spent so much of my life trying to hold on to something that wasn't even real. I had tried to make it work with someone who had already checked out, who had already moved on, long before I even knew what was happening. I got up from the bench, my legs stiff, but there was no hesitation in my steps. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need anyone to tell me it was going to be okay. I already knew that. The next few days came and went in a haze of introspection and decisions. I booked a flight. It was something I had been putting off for far too long, a trip I'd wanted to take even before everything fell apart. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need to. I left for the coast, to a small town I had visited once years ago. It was peaceful there, far from the noise of the city, far from the echoes of my past. It was the kind of place where no one knew my name, where I could start fresh. I rented a small house near the beach, a humble place with a view of the ocean that took my breath away the first time I saw it. There was no grand plan. No big idea. Just me, a few bags, and an overwhelming sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. In that small house, with the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, I finally felt like I could let go. I spent my days walking along the beach, sometimes in silence, sometimes with music in my ears, just thinking. I didn't need answers anymore. I didn't need closure. I just needed space to figure out who I was without her, without the life I thought I would have. The loneliness wasn't as painful as I had imagined. It was more like a quiet companion, reminding me of how far I had come. I wasn't lost. I wasn't broken. I was still here, and that was enough. One evening, as the sun set behind the waves, I sat on the sand with a drink in my hand, watching the colors of the sky melt into the water. It wasn't a grand epiphany, but in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I didn't need someone to fill the emptiness. And as I watched the sky turn dark, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It was like I had finally stepped out of the shadow of the past and into something new. A future that wasn't defined by the mistakes of others, a future where I could finally be in control of my own happiness. I hadn't expected it to feel like this. The unexpected was always lurking, always twisting my plans, but for once, the chaos had led me somewhere good. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was mine. The days went by. I kept to myself, focusing on the little things. I learned to cook again, to enjoy the quiet moments of solitude. I started to write, something I had neglected for far too long. I allowed myself to feel again, without the weight of the past dragging me down. And then, one afternoon, I received a letter. It was from Samantha. I hadn't been expecting it, but I knew it had to happen eventually. The letter was filled with apologies, regret, and excuses. She told me she had made a terrible mistake, that she wished things had turned out differently, that she missed me. I didn't read it all the way through. I didn't need to. I had heard enough. I took the letter outside, walked to the fire pit in the backyard, and set it aflame. As the paper burned, the smoke rising into the sky, I felt a strange sense of closure. This was it. This was the final goodbye. The last piece of her, the last remnant of a life I had outgrown, was gone. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I stayed on the coast for a while longer, but eventually, I packed up and returned to the city. Things were different now. I was different now. I had let go, and in doing so, I had found myself again. Life had thrown its worst at me, but I had survived. And that, in itself, was a victory. The weeks passed like days, and the days like hours. Everything around me felt in motion, but it was different this time. I wasn't caught in the whirlwind of someone else's actions anymore. I wasn't held captive by the mistakes of my past or the lies she'd woven around me. There was a certain stillness I had found in the chaos, something I hadn't known I needed until I found it. I settled back into the city a month later, but even as I walked its streets again, something inside me was completely different. People looked at me, and I wondered if they could see it, if they could sense the shift that had happened inside me. I'd walked away from something broken, and now I was walking toward something new, even though I couldn't name it yet. One afternoon, I was sitting at a coffee shop on the corner of an old street, staring out the window. The coffee was good, but the real comfort was in the anonymity of it all. I could sit there and watch people, hear their conversations, without anyone knowing who I was, what I'd been through. I wasn't the man who had been betrayed anymore. I was just another face, another person drifting through the world, unnoticed, untethered. I thought about what had happened with Samantha. I had burned her letter without a second thought, but the truth was, I still hadn't fully processed the depth of her betrayal. The way she had lied, the way she had manipulated me, it still lingered in the back of my mind, like a faint, bitter taste I couldn't wash away. But it wasn't consuming me anymore. It was just part of the past, part of the wreckage that came with the life I'd left behind. I thought I'd be angry forever, but I wasn't. I thought I'd be heartbroken forever, but I wasn't. I had been so sure that without her, without the life I thought I had, would be lost. But the more time passed, the more I realized just how much of myself I'd given away to someone who never cared about me. And as much as it had hurt, I was grateful for it. I had been broken, but in that brokenness, I had found myself. The things I had once relied on, her approval, her love, her presence, were gone. And in their place, there was a new sense of freedom, of self, that I hadn't known was possible. I was no longer defined by the past, by what had been done to me, by the years I had wasted. I had let all that go, and now I was standing on the edge of something new. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't scare me anymore. It was mine to figure out. My future was mine. But just when I thought I had moved on, the past came crashing back. It was a late afternoon when I ran into him, Brian. The man who had been with Samantha. The one who had been there while I was still living in a dream, unaware of the reality that was unraveling beneath me. I was walking down the same street I'd passed 1,000 times before, lost in my thoughts, when I turned the corner and saw him. He was standing there, looking as if he had just stepped out of some nightmare I'd forgotten about. His eyes caught mine, and for a moment, I thought I imagined it. But no, there he was, right in front of me. I froze. He froze. For the briefest of moments, neither of us moved. It was like time had stopped. "You," he said, his voice tight, like he was trying to force the words out. There was an edge to his tone that caught me off guard. The shame, the guilt, the realization that everything between us, between him and me, had been a lie. I didn't respond at first. I didn't know what to say. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. A year ago, I would have said something harsh. A year ago, I would have demanded answers, demanded retribution. But now, standing there, looking at him, at the man who had so callously torn apart my life, I just felt nothing. "What are you doing here?" he asked again, like he was searching for something, for some kind of meaning to what had happened. He was still clinging to the idea that there was some explanation, some reason for it all. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping me. "I'm just living. Not that it's any of your business." His face darkened, but I could see the way his hands twitched, like he wanted to do something but wasn't sure what. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I didn't want to hurt you. You have to know that." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. Was he serious? Was he really standing here trying to justify himself? "No," I said quietly, "I don't understand. Because you don't hurt someone you don't care about. You don't destroy someone's life for your own selfish gain and expect them to just forget about it." I took a step forward, meeting his eyes squarely. "And you don't stand there trying to pretend it didn't happen, either." His gaze dropped to the ground, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, guilt? Remorse? But it was gone in a flash. Just like everything with him, just like everything with her, it was fleeting. It didn't last. "Look, man," he said, his voice softer now, "I didn't know what I was doing. It just happened. It wasn't supposed to get this far." I laughed, a hollow sound that surprised even me. "Yeah, sure. You didn't know. But you knew enough to stay with her, didn't you? To lie to both of us. To use me as your fool while she fed me whatever lies she needed to keep me in the dark." I paused. "And I'm the one who's supposed to understand?" He didn't have an answer. There was no answer to that. "I don't need anything from you, Brian," I said. "Not now, not ever. Whatever you had with her, whatever you thought you were doing, it's over. I'm done with it. I'm done with all of it." And with that, I turned away. I didn't look back. Because I didn't have to. That chapter was closed. It had ended long before I walked away from the wreckage, long before I realized what it really meant to let go. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anything, except the freedom to move forward, to write the next part of my story. I walked away from Brian, my steps slow but sure, as if with every footfall, I was leaving more of the past behind me. There was no need for any more words. Nothing left to say to him, to her, or to anyone who had ever been part of the life I'd once known. I wasn't running from it anymore, I had already run far enough. It wasn't the anger or bitterness that drove me now. It wasn't the desire for revenge or even for closure. It was something simpler, something deeper, a quiet understanding that I had lived through it, and I had come out the other side. As I walked through the streets, the city didn't feel as oppressive as it once did. The same streets that had once seemed suffocating, filled with memories and ghosts, now felt like just another backdrop to the life I was building. The buildings were taller, the sounds were louder, but I was no longer part of the chaos. I hadn't planned on it, but I found myself back at that little coffee shop. The same one where I had sat all those weeks ago, lost in the weight of it all. This time, I was different. I was lighter, even in the same place. I walked in, and the warmth of the shop wrapped around me, familiar but not stifling. The barista smiled as I approached, as if recognizing something about me had changed, even without knowing the full story. I ordered my coffee, the same drink I always used to get, and sat by the window, letting the world pass by. This time, I didn't feel like an outsider. I didn't feel like a man broken by betrayal, a man defined by loss. I felt whole. I took a sip of my drink, savoring the warmth. And that's when I realized, I was finally free. I wasn't free because she was gone or because I had confronted him. I wasn't free because I had burned the letter or because I was now standing here in a place where I felt some sense of calm. No. I was free because I had stopped looking for something outside myself to fix me. I had stopped needing anyone's approval or validation. The power to heal was within me all along, and once I'd stopped searching for it in others, I found it. The world felt full of possibilities again. I didn't know what came next, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't need to. I wasn't waiting for answers anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me how my story ended. I was writing it, one day at a time. And if life threw more curveballs my way, if more people came and went, I would face it. But this time, I would face it as me, whole, grounded, and strong enough to know that no matter what happened, I could stand on my own 2 feet. The past no longer had power over me. It was just that, the past. A collection of events, of choices, of moments that had shaped me, yes, but no longer defined me. I left the coffee shop with a smile on my face, stepping out into the world, knowing that everything I needed was already within me. The city hummed around me, but I wasn't lost in it. I was part of it. And for the first time, I felt like I could take whatever came next and make it mine. Because the best part of this new beginning wasn't just surviving what had happened. It was realizing that the life ahead of me was waiting for me to show up, and this time, I was showing up as the person I was always meant to be. No more waiting. No more wondering. Just living. And I couldn't wait to see where this next chapter would take me.